started. Talking about getting started with SOPs, and just so that you all know, I am recording this webinar, and we will be making this archive available on the SOP Cooperative website as soon as I figure out how to do it. So today's objectives, I think it's really important when you get started to define what do you mean by an SOP and some of the goals behind it. So we'll talk about what is your definition for an SOP, and then we'll talk about a few tips and ideas for getting started. So when I think about SOPs, a lot of times I will go back to the standard definition of SOPs. EPA developed a guidance document in 2017 that I see a lot of people reference. And so when you look at this, the EPA definition is a set of written instructions that document a routine or repetitive activity followed by an organization. So when I look at this definition, I kind of add to it. I look at this written instructions. And so one thing that we've noticed with SOPs are most folks start out thinking about just writing everything down. We are now seeing people doing pictures and graphs and charts for parts of SOPs, flow charts. We are also seeing people do videos for SOPs. So I think the definition of an SOP may be a little larger than what EPA is saying. The second thing I look at is routine or repetitive activity. And I may challenge the definition a little bit because I think that a lot of times we want SOPs for activities that are not routine, something that's seasonal that we may need to remember how to do it over and over again. Or I know that a lot of people use SOPs as part of their emergency response plan. So routine or repetitive, yes, that's something that we like to document and get the activities, but I think we may want to expand that definition. So I just brought the EPA definition up and tried to give you some ideas of how you can do this. The important thing, I think, is developing your own definition for your organization. So one thing that I also think about is I think of standard operating procedures as a communication device, a knowledge sharing device. And so I think there's many things that you can use the SOPs for. So as any communication device, we want to be thinking about who are we writing for? Who is our audience? We want to figure out why are we doing this? What issues are we trying to address by what are our drivers? And then I think it's always it's good to identify any challenges you may have, and so you can figure out alternatives to get around it. So let's get into the audience. Who are you writing for, and who are you developing these SOPs for? And I break it into two kind of categories just to start thinking about it. Internal audiences versus external audiences. Typically when we talk about SOPs, we think about writing it for the operations staff, and we're writing it for operators. But you know, the engineering staff may have SOPs, or they may have a different idea behind it. Water quality and laboratory typically have standard operating procedures for all of their methods and for all the things that are going on in the laboratory. And one thing, you know, interesting is labs and operations think a little differently. They have different kinds of procedures, so you may have a different SOP. When you think about management writing SOPs, operations wants to get down to nuts and bolts, but managers, when managers are writing it, they're thinking about more of the big goals for the organizations. So your SOPs may cover more of the goals rather than the simple how to do. So each one who is writing it or who your audience for the SOP will change how you write it. You can also think external audiences. So if you're writing for an external audience, like your contractors, for example, you know, you have to think this in a different light. If you're writing for a contractor, you will be, you know, the contractor will only do the steps that are in the SOP. If you miss a step, they probably won't do it. The other thing about thinking about working with contractors is there may be a liability issue also associated with that. And so if if they do the procedure and someone gets hurt, you could be getting liability. So you have to be thinking along at different lines when you're writing for an external audience like a contractor. Regulators will be looking for how are you going to comply Other departments in your organization may be using it. And I think some folks on the line, I believe, are wholesalers. So if you're a wholesaler of utility and you're sending it to another utility that probably just running the distribution system, how they operate their distribution system can have some impact on you. So writing for that audience may be different, and they may also have a slightly different language than your system. Also, if you're writing focusing on your operators, you could be having different audiences. And as you can see, by clearly defining this audience, you can start thinking about different approaches. If you're writing it for your current staff that have been there for a long time, you're going to have one focus. Or if you have a crew, different crews, like 3 or 4 crews doing that same job, well, you want them to be doing it the same way. And if they happen to leave off on step 3, the next crew you want to start right at step 4, and they know that that's what's going to be happening. So you can help work with, you have different crews. Another thing we hear on SOPs for new employees is we think about, well, the SOP should be anybody off the street should be able to use our SOP. So you can see that like a new employee versus current staff, you'd probably put a different description because the new employees probably don't have your language. They probably don't know your full definitions. So the new employees, you may have to work with them and write an SOP a little differently. The last one is standby operations or cross-training. I know John Stoddard's on the line from Boulder, and they have a standby operator that is in the middle of the evening working on for their system, and he needs to know a little bit about everything that's going on within the organization. So the standby operator, you're writing for that person rather than someone who does the task all the time. So each one of these can change how you write your SOP. And then finally, I sort of already alluded to this, it could be routine tasks, could be non-routine tasks, or emergency response procedures. So in your question box, if you can get in your question box, I just want to hear from you all. Who is your primary audience? Who do you focus on with your SOPs? Is it an internal audience? Is it an external audience? And then what type of tasks do you focus in on? So if you take a second and just get into your questions box and just give me a little feedback here. Okay, so we hear for current staff, for cross-training, and then for new hires. So when you start looking for current staff versus new hires, have a little different language. Internal and maintenance personnel. Process and safety procedures. Great, that's a good addition. Fred puts on here for routine operations, and then Bob's saying internal staff. So a lot of internal staff, but we can also be looking at it for other groups. Yeah, same John Stoddard, current new hires. Again, another safety. Yeah, so safety, it could be a real driver for procedures. Oh, here's one that's a little different from Aaron from EPA. Internal legal and internal and administrative duties. So yeah, so we can, legal staff, boy, they look at an SOP quite significantly different. Let's see if there's anything else. Oh, contract operators also. So yeah, we can start seeing some of a variety of different drivers coming through here as we're looking at and different audiences. Oh, also state testing or internal lab for state testing. Yes, thanks, Barb. Okay, so with that, so we sort of find our audience. The clearer you are on your audience, the easier it is to write. And some folks say, can we do multiple audiences? And I say, my answer typically is, yes, you can do multiple audiences, but it's really best if you can focus on specific audiences. And if you're doing internal and external audiences, you may want to actually do a separate SOP for an internal audience and then rewrite it for an external audience. So now let's talk about drivers. Why do we need the SOPs? Okay. Oops, here we go. So the first thing we look at up at the top of this here is consistency. So if we're doing SOPs, we can get a consistent product. And so if we wanted the same procedure done the same way all the time, very important for consistency perspective. Continuity is capturing knowledge. I got into standard operating procedures because I was working in knowledge management, the knowledge management arena. And SOPs are a great place to capture your knowledge of how you handle your system. Very important. On the productivity side, you know, the example that I know the best on this one is Denver Water. For their system, they have to touch every fire hydrant. They used to do it twice a year, and now they're doing it once a year throughout their whole system. And I believe they have 20,000 or more, maybe even more, fire hydrants. By going through this procedure over and over again and defining it, they were able to cut their time for maintenance of their fire hydrants by 25%. So when you're doing that many hydrants, that saves a whole heck of a lot of time. We've talked about safety, and I think safety is really important to be thinking about the idea of documenting your procedures to make sure that people are doing it safe. And then the other aspect is taking your SOPs and using it for your training program. When your training program fits exactly what your procedures are, it can be much more effective. There can be a lot of other motivators. Permit compliance. If you are working in the stormwater arena, permit compliance is very important to have SOPs. If you have a risk management plan using free chlorine gas, if you're using chlorine gas, you need to have permits under the risk management program there. Can also reduce liability by having, if someone gets hurt, one of the first questions someone's going to ask, an attorney is going to ask is, do you have a standard operating procedure and what is covered in there? And there's a variety of other things, succession planning and so forth. You can read these here. I think the important thing is defining what are your motivators for developing standard operating procedures. Okay, so we have a poll, and I'm going to figure out if I can get a poll going here. We're going to see how this works. And the poll is, what is your primary driver for developing standard operating procedures? So if you will get on your computer there and click one of the buttons and then click submit, we'll be able to get some answers on the polls. So I'm getting some responses already. We're going to let a few more come in. Okay. One more minute here. Okay, cool. Okay, so what I'm going to do is close the poll, and then I am going to share the responses with you. And so you can see I'm on the screen right now that consistency and productivity seems to be the number 1 thing. Then we have capturing knowledge, but we also see folks from the safety, reducing liability, and regulatory. So what's good to see on this graph and think about your organization is when you define this up front, you're going to be writing this from a different perspective. If safety is your number 1 driver, you might write it differently than if consistency is your number 1 driver. All right, so I'm going to hide that, and we'll keep moving forward. So then the question comes out, what could hold you back? What are your challenges? And why is this thing just so difficult? First off, there is time and resources to develop your standard operating procedures. Okay, that typically is one of the number 1 problems with this. Of course, I thought I had everything muted here. Okay, so time and resources to develop your standard operating procedures. The next is getting started. Just getting things going seems to be a real challenge. Okay, the next is putting value on your standard operating procedures and really understanding the value of getting these done. Bureaucracy and approval process. When you start getting into the safety and regulatory issues, you start running into some challenges, especially with making sure that you get levels of approval. And one thing that can happen to your SOP process is that the level of approval can actually start to hinder you from getting these done. So making sure that you address that. And I think really the one that almost comes down to it is SOPs typically are other duties as may be assigned. It's not a priority. There's no dedicated person to write the standard operating procedures. It's when you have time. And as I know, as the folks that are sitting out here in the audience, you're probably going, yeah, we always have a lot of extra time to do something. I think it's really important if you dedicate someone to do this, ensure that they have the resources to be able to do that and follow up with them. Some other challenges. We expect our subject matter experts also to be expert writers. And so I think one of the challenges that we look at is some of the people that we may have the knowledge in their heads and we want to capture that knowledge from them may not be great writers. A great story that I've heard from one system was their chief operator, 35 years of experience, was getting ready to retire. And they asked him to sit down for the last month or two while he was there to start writing down all his standard operating procedures. And a couple of weeks went by, and they went in and they asked him, where's your SOPs? And he hadn't written anything. And he said, well, you better do this or we're going to get rid of you early. And he still didn't write it. And eventually it turned out that he was pretty functionally illiterate. He could read a little bit, but he couldn't write. But he could run that plant better than anybody else, and he really knew what was going on there. So what they ended up having to do is they had to hire a graduate student to be able to document and interview him and write down the procedures. But again, he was the subject matter expert. He knew more than anybody else about that facility, but he wasn't a writer. So you must recognize that. Then there's this analysis paralysis. Our SOPs aren't perfect. And, I think it's really important when we think about this is when is good enough? And so most folks, I say, start writing it, get it down, and continue to improve it over time. Finally, this fear of not actually capturing or accurately capturing the steps. There's a lot of fear with making a mistake and what would happen if we make a mistake. The other challenge that we see is that most folks are reinventing the wheel. Almost every system is developing standard operating procedures in some form. And one thing that we have developed within the Standard Operating Procedure Cooperative is a way to share some of the SOPs, so you're not reinventing the wheel. So with all this thinking of it, it's really important for you, if you're going to be doing a program for your organization, is to really sit back and look at this definition, finalizing your definition. So start with the EPA definition. I think it's a great place to start. And then what I would say is document who your primary audiences are, what your drivers are, what other type tasks you might be able to address, and then develop your own definition and share it with your organization. Okay, so after you've got your definition, you've got some thinking about that, and we're not going to spend time giving you time today to write your own definition. I think you can go back and do that. The next thing you need to consider is how to get started a program. And the steps that I look at is sort of develop a template first, making sure that you all are in agreement on what you're going to put in these standard operating procedures. Talk about how many do you need, and then the next webcast next week will be on how do you decide which SOPs you need and how many do you need. And the third challenge is probably the hardest one, is take a pen, or actually nowadays get to your computer keyboard and start writing. And then finally, to finalize or formalize your process. formalize how you're going to be handling it. So we'll go through each one of these 4 steps. So the first thing is to develop a template. Now in the Tools and Template folder in the shared drive for the SOP Cooperative, we have an example template. I'd like to give it to folks and say, here's an example, and then modify it to fit your organization. So I think there's a lot of ability to do this. We try to give something to help people get started, but realize you may want to have flexibility to change it. And so the template components, I sort of think about it. What do we recommend you have in there? What's sometimes good to have in there? Things that are nice to have, but really, maybe may not fit in your template. And then things that you shouldn't include under any circumstances. And then finally, I'll touch on real quickly on innovative formats. So the recommended information. The first thing is this consistent header. You want the standard operating procedures to look similar, so if someone can see it, they know it's a standard operating procedure, and it has information that you need to be able to keep track of it. It has a title, it has who are your contacts, who wrote it, things along that lines. The dates, very important to know, is this a new SOP, is it an old SOP, when was it last modified? I love seeing a document location so you can find it, and if you need to be able to get a copy of it or share a copy of it, who are the authorized persons to do the tasks, those kind of things. Having that standard in every one of your operating procedures, I think, is very valuable. The next thing is the purpose, your background or your objective. I've seen each term used. I've seen purpose used, I've seen objective used, I've seen background used. All 3 of those to me mean giving some sort of statement of what this SOP covers, what it doesn't cover, and why are we doing this SOP. So some sort of background information to be able to set the stage for it. And so, and also one thing on background I've seen people do a lot, which I really like, is if there's some language or definitions that you need to be able to have to be able to understand the rest SOP, you can either have a definition section or you can put it in your background. The next thing on here is safety issues. And I put afterwards, unique to the standard operating procedure. And we'll talk about this here a little bit more in a second, but it's very important to identify specific safety concerns with the SOP, but not cover all of your safety program in this document, because otherwise the document becomes very long and unmanageable, so you may do links to it. Equipment, especially for distribution or transmission crews, having things, what needs to be in my truck when I go out in the field, having that equipment checklist. I've seen it as part of the SOP, and I've also seen checklists that have incorporated with the SOP, so that when you get out in the field, you've got the tools that you have. Then it's the procedure. So there's a lot of things you can see before we get to the step-by-step. Now, again, if you're limited on time, you may just want to start with the step-by-step procedures and then add some of these things afterwards. But I think it's one of those things to be thinking about. I put it down further in the list, even though that's where most people start. The final is documentation and record keeping. If you have a form or some specific record keeping, having a section for that I think is very valuable in every one of the SOPs. Sometimes recommended, especially if it is a regulatory concern, you have an operating limit and a response. The example is free chlorine or chlorine residual coming out of your plant. If it is this SOP covers between 0.5 and 1.5 milligrams per liter chlorine residual. If it goes outside that, this SOP no longer covers it, go to our emergency response plan, or something to that effect. Having that in there is very valuable. And so I sometimes recommend that, especially things that do have operating limits and responses that you can identify. The last thing is revision frequency. Sometimes it can be right in the SOP, or it can be later on in your procedures for standard operating procedures. Things that are nice to have, additional resources, locations for manuals, links to other things that you can be able to have. One I really like is tips, troubleshooting, and lessons learned. I think about standard operating procedures from a knowledge management and a knowledge capture perspective. So when I'm thinking along those terms, now, getting these tips or lessons learned is really valuable to get in the standard operating procedure. The next one, disclaimer. If you're giving this to a contractor, you're giving this to an outside organization, putting a disclaimer is very valuable, because you can say, hey, this SOP is the best practice, but we may have missed something. Use your judgment, or something to that effect, to be able to say, hey, this is a guide, but it's not the whole thing. You need training also, or whatever, to protect yourself. Folks are adding visual aids and pictures, historical information. In the past, we did it this way, and now we are doing it another way. The one I really love is humor. Greg Farmer from Littleton Inglewood, a wastewater facility, he adds every now and then jokes in the standard operating procedure. And people will actually look through his SOP, at least I know I do, look through his SOP to try to find a joke that's in there. Anything that we can get people to use the SOP, the more important it is. And then finally, review and distribution. Some folks would like to have all the people that were involved with reviewing and distributing that SOP either sign off on it or at least be acknowledged in the SOP. Things not to include, and it's policies or procedures that are general in nature and lengthy program descriptions that are recorded elsewhere. This is your safety plan, for example. If you, again, you talk about the things that are specific to this SOP, but your general procedures, your confined space procedure, which can be multiple pages, or your trenching and shoring procedure, all of those things, you want to have a link to that, and you want people to be able to get access to it, but it may not fit into every single SOP. So it's a balance between making sure people have this information and where can they get it. But so again, I don't think you should be doing that. Also, policies and procedures can be personnel policies, and you may want to link somewhere else. So the trick is to be able to get the right level of detail for the one procedure, but point people to stuff that they need to know elsewhere. Then we start thinking innovative formats. The more that I see that folks are doing work on standard operating procedures, some of the more innovative things that start happening. You see checklists, and I love this picture down here on the bottom right. This was from one of the cooperative members' SOPs, and they basically laminated it and put it on the piece of equipment, and then they realized that people may not really read that even though it's sitting right there. So you can sort of see on the right, they say change tubing at so-and-so number of frequencies, and then they set the thing at 2 million revolutions or whatever. The idea is they're posting it right on their equipment. They're laminating there so that they're taking that so people can see that. I think that's really fabulous. So let's take a look at some real quick example templates. And the first thing you see on this picture, and it's not so important to be able to get down to the details of it, but visually they all look different. The one in the top right from the city of Aurora Water, the very textual based 2.1, 2.3, 2.4. The one down towards the bottom right, you can see very graphical. That's from Boulder, their hydro plant. Very picture oriented, few texts. So you can kind of see immediately some different pictures. On the top left, this is another one from the city of Boulder, and you can just see their logo up there. You can see a lot of their header information. And actually, it looks a little bit like what I recommend from the template. I really like Boulder's, and I use a lot of their design when I put the template together for the cooperative. One thing that Boulder also does that I really like is they have these icons in their actual SOPs. So if there's a general tip or general information or a tip, this is kind of that lessons learned. They will put these little highlight boxes in their right in the middle of the SOP, and your eye goes right to these. You might miss a little bit of the text, but you're seeing that important tip. Same with safety or personal protective equipment. And finally, keys are required. Call the operator before opening the hatch. One thing that we do see is passwords are required. And some people actually put the passwords into the SOP. I'm not sure if I would do that, but you will see that. This was a picture from a SOP that was developed for the city of Loveland. And this was for collecting algae samples. And what they did was, which was really fascinating, was not only did they put the location, they put the coordinates and so forth, they took a picture of each one of the sampling sites for their SOP. Good and bad. One thing is great is every person that comes out there will know exactly where to take the sample. I'm not sure bad is the right word, but what they did was when they came back to the facility, they found out that, oh, I don't know if I would take the sample. And they were able actually to have a lot of discussion on, is this the appropriate location to take the sample? And so they were actually able to change this because they documented it in their SOP. Littleton Inglewood, great example. They love tagging things. And especially when you're calling a pig, it says here, a pig inserted into the tubing, and I'm wondering what a pig looks like. And so they have a picture, they circle where it is. Helps with terminology. The more labels and pictures you can have, a picture's worth 1,000 words. I agree, and the more adding these labels really make them valuable. Again, they use the same idea. They'll use graphics, or they'll actually go take a picture of everything in the field, so that you can see when the SOP refers to such and such, you actually see this and you can relate it to what you see in the field. Another thing that's really great is, especially for a main break, is having a notification procedure or a flow chart. Again, I know some people do their SOPs just as flow charts, which I think works for a lot of organizations. In this case, if we have an emergency, here's who we contact, here's the flow. Having this available is really valuable. Now, this procedure I know is outdated because we've had some retirements. So if you do a notification procedure like this and you mention an individual, when you get retirements, you better make sure that you are also updating these procedures. Finally, video SOPs. What we were able to do from one of the standard operating procedures that we had in the library, I also work part-time for the Rural Community Assistance Partnership, and we were able to take one of those and make a video. So if you want to see hydrant inspection and flushing, a video about that SOP, it's available on YouTube. The Baywork, which is a California organization for knowledge management and so forth, they have a procedure for documenting standard operating procedures. So you can see that, and I believe the Baywork SOP is available online. Again, this is the example of the template that's available in the library. I put this there for people to be able to use and modify. So it is there in the templates section of the library. Again, feel free to get in there, use it, and make what fits for your organization. So we're going to do one more poll here on your templates. Let me see if I get to it. Okay, so in front of you, our standard template is consistently used, occasionally used, or we don't have a standard template. So go ahead and take a shot on that, and we'll take a look and get some answers here. Cool. Give you one more second. We've got about 3/4 of the folks have voted so far. Okay. All right, we're going to close this off, and I'm going to share the results. So about 42% don't have a standard template, and then you can see a quarter consistently use it, and occasionally use it. Now, if you, I've invited some folks on the line that are not SOP cooperative members. After this webinar, if you let me know, I will make sure you get a copy of the template. Cecilia from Pueblo, I will make sure that after this call, I get you access to the library. I see your question. I'll get you the password and instructions on how to operate that. So again, if you need a copy of it, we'll be happy to share this with you. But having a standard template is great, and then you can see only a third occasionally use it, and we find that within a lot of organizations. All right, so we'll keep moving forward. So you've got a template, now you got to figure out which SOPs do we need. And the goal is to develop a list of standard operating procedures. One thing that I've seen is people will put a whiteboard in somewhere in their facility, and people can write down, you know, we need an SOP on X and Y topics. You know, so figuring out a process for your organization to do this, then to figure out a process to prioritize your SOPs, and then to continually evaluate when you get this process and continually make sure you have a prioritization. Now, one thing that we've asked is the state of Colorado to be able to look at this is there a list of tasks that we consider the most important? So we've asked this for the state of Colorado, and on their frequently asked questions, they say no, and they go through a lot of language, but basically says only anything that could impact water quality or quantity we want to see an SOP. And it's really important, but it's really, while I agree, it's really hard to be able to define what SOPs do you need. So what we did for the cooperative is we tried to say, you know, these are what we think are your core SOPs. These are the ones that everybody should have. And so we came up with this idea of, you know, the core, everybody should have this. These are the SOPs that should be developed first, and so forth, to be able to guide that discussion. Because it's really hard to have one that covers everything without having some guidance. So we've developed cores for water distribution system, for the wastewater collection system, preliminary wastewater treatment, and the water treatment just keeps evolving. So we're still calling it draft because it's pretty hard to have just a core list for the treatment aspects. In the distribution core, as you look at this, it has, you know, hydrant inspection and maintenance, valve flushing, hydrant flushing, or valve exercising, hydrant flushing. You can see the list here. The ones that we see with asterisks on them were identified by AWWA's Partnership for Safe Water. So we asked a lot of other groups about getting some of their, what do they think should be on their list, and we incorporate those into our core. Now, these are a great place to start, but you can see things that are missing. How to replace a meter, and a variety of other things that you will see that you might think of for your system. We want to give you a place to start. It's not the place to end, it's just the place to start. So you get your list, you prioritized it, and we're going to really talk in the next webinar next week about getting that list and prioritizing it a lot more. The third thing is to really start writing. And you start looking at what do we want to actually put in this. So do we want to document existing practices? Are we writing, are we comparing it to other utilities? Do we want to have best practices? Or do we just want to really have the vendor or manufacturer recommendation? One of the points when you start writing is, what are we writing about? Are we just talking about existing practices, or are we trying to improve them? Again, a lot of times I get this question, and my suggestion would be start with existing practices, and if you need to move forward, you can start looking at best practices afterwards. And then the question comes out when we're there, what is a complete SOP when we write it? And we looked at main break standard operating procedures, and we found that almost no two organizations covered the same amount of content. Some focused in on the investigation. How do we find out if it really is a main break? How do we operate valves? Some folks are doing differently. Some systems really focus in on the notification. Here's how we would notify X, Y, and Z. I think it's, in small utilities, notification is, not as important. Risk management procedures, Denver Water and Boulder have developed really good risk management procedures for when they need to notify the public, when they need to notify the state. And for the state of Colorado, when you submit a SOP to the state of Colorado for main breaks, you can handle your main breaks and notify them differently. So it's very important for them to have a good SOP. Who are the on-site responsibilities? I've seen the downhole person has a responsibility. The person above the hole has another responsibility. Incident command. Denver Water has a lot of main breaks in the middle of a big city. And so they have to set up incident command components so that they can manage it. So depending on your organization, you want to be able to look at that. And then there's all sorts of supporting information that can happen with a main break. On the left is the state of Colorado's water quality procedure, the protocol for having an outage. There's one, the step-by-step is Colorado Springs example. Your door hangers, we have a couple door hangers in there. On the bottom right, I thought this was great, City of Westminster, was how do we calculate or estimate the flow from our main break so that we can do a water loss calculation. And this is one example of how they did that. And then get started writing. The concern always is like falling off a cliff. Yes, that is a picture of me as one of my young and stupid days. But the idea is your friends will get you all set up, then they're going to push you off, and then you actually got to survive as you go through the process. I think the thing with start writing is really get that going. And then finally, we're going to do a full webinar on the process and developing SOP processes, but really formalize your process. It could be a flow chart, it could be a set of procedures. What is your process for developing SOPs? And again, it's the who. Who writes it? We've already talked about this. Is it a subject matter expert? Is it a team? Is it a consultant? And I'm a consultant and I help organizations write SOPs. One thing about it is I always talk to the operators and spend a lot of time. I don't really think you probably want your consultants to tell you how to operate, just to write their SOPs without involving your staff. So be concerned with that. And then the question, as I've already mentioned, is how is this reflected in job responsibilities? Then this process, how are they identified and how they are prioritized? Again, the webinar next week will really get into the details of identifying these and prioritizing. Having this time frame, I think, is very important. How are we going to schedule these? Who's going to do them? How often are we going to update them? And I always love this thing in here, when mistakes are found, what is the process for correcting them? And so we want to make sure that we are using these. These are living documents, and we improve them with time. Then where do we store these, and how do we make them available to staff? And the picture of the guy with a handheld device, I think, is really important. I think in the future, we're going to be getting these out to the people mobile. And we want them in the field where people are actually needing the SOPs. So how do we make these available? Finally, how do we get them used? We don't want to go through this exercise, have a beautiful document, put it up on the shelf, and then no one ever uses it, and it just collects dust. I think it's very important that we do some training, we get people involved around the SOPs, and we get them out there using them in the field. And training, to me, is the avenue to be able to do that. Okay, so we're going to do one final poll here. Do you have a process for developing and managing SOPs? So the answer is yes, we could improve it. We're getting started, or we have no process. So I'm seeing the votes coming in. Got a little bit over half. Give one more minute here. All right, so let me close the poll, and we'll share the results. Also, we've got no one on the line that has a procedure that they feel really 100% bomb-proof. One thing we can work with you. But yes, we can improve it. Half of you guys are just getting started, and 10% have no process. Again, if you're a SOP cooperative member, I see Barb Lilly's online. Barb, I've talked with Blair about coming and doing a lunchtime presentation on this to your staff. So this is available for cooperative members for me to come talk to your staff if you would like this. But we do have guidelines in the tools and templates stuff, but we'd also like to work with your organization. Okay, so just to wrap things up, talk about the cooperative and what some of the things that we are doing. We have an example library. I think that this reinventing the wheel we're trying to address. And so we do have about 800 example SOPs. They're not, some of them, you know, for example, for main breaks, I think we have 8 or 10 examples in the library. And we continue to capture more and more that we can in the library. We only share these with cooperative members, and they're password protected. We have this list of developing cores to be able to get an idea of what SOP should we have. We are looking at tools and templates, and we'll be doing, this is a webcast, we occasionally do conference calls, and we do provide training. The next webcast will be next Thursday. It'll be an hour later at 10 o'clock. We just had to work around another conflict, but again, we'll be doing this, and we'll be addressing the issue of how many SOPs do we need, tips for identifying and prioritizing SOPs for development. So that will be the focus of the next webcast. So just as a summary, I think as we covered here, and we covered a lot of material pretty quick, and I'd be happy to talk further with anyone about this, is get a good definition of what you're trying to achieve in an SOP. And then as you're getting going, develop this, get a process. Start with a template, talk about which ones you need, how many, start writing, and then formalize your process. If there's any questions, as I'm finalizing it, feel free to add something into the question box. I've seen a couple people that are looking for this. John, I see you're going to be out of town next week. Don't blame you. I'll be getting back in town just in time for this, but we will be archiving all of these webcasts and making them available on the SOP Cooperative website. Unfortunately, we can't give you training units when you're doing that. So again, but we will get that to folks. I've also had questions about how to access the SOP library. What we will do about the SOP library is, again, cooperative members, I can send you a link and your password, or how to set up your password to get access to the SOP library. Any other questions? Okay, with that, when I hang up, a survey will appear for you to take a look at. And again, I appreciate your time today and look forward to talking to you all in the future. All right, you all take care now.